All right, we're going to talk about poverty in this video and really think about the way that sociologists go about answering the question, why do we even have poverty? What is going on that produces poverty? Why are some people poor and others are not? So let's dive right into figuring this out. So the core way I want us to think about explaining poverty is to distinguish between individualistic and structural explanations for this. Now, this is a big idea because this is really at the core of sociology itself. Sociologists are going to, by default, take more structural explanations. And I think in the U.S. especially, we're used to thinking about things in terms of individuals and thinking and using individualistic reasoning to explain a variety of phenomena. So what I'm going to do is just really overview first what it means to think or to explain things from an individualistic standpoint versus a structural standpoint, and then we'll move into thinking about poverty in these terms. So in general, when sociologists talk about individual explanations for things, it focuses on the individual traits that people possess. It's explaining phenomenon, explaining some outcome in terms of the characteristics, the traits, the behaviors of individuals. So it roots the entire explanation in something about individuals. So if two individuals experience a different outcome, an individualistic explanation is going to focus in on something about differences between those individuals to explain that. So when you're thinking about individualistic explanations, you're thinking about an explanation rooted in the particular aspects, traits, characteristics, properties of individuals themselves. And this is very different from structural explanations. At the core of structural explanations is a focus on the social context around the individual that shapes the outcome. So it's a focus on things outside of or external to individuals that impact in on the individuals and shape what's going on. So just in the contrast with individualistic explanations, instead of looking inside the individuals or at the properties of individuals, this is looking at properties of the social context around them. If two individuals have a different outcome, then the question becomes, okay, what is the differences in the context in which they are experiencing and living? Now, sociologists really, I think most explanations that sociologists will give center that social context around three different kinds of factors. To think about institutions, social institutions, to think about social relationships, or to think about culture. When we're thinking about social institutions, what we have in mind are the kind of rules, laws, norms, expectations that guide how individuals think and how they act in the world. So it's thinking about things like the laws that govern housing or govern labor markets, govern employment relationships that then shape what individuals are able to do inside of them. When we're thinking about social relations as a context, what we're really thinking about is simply our relationships with others. What's our social network like? Who are we connected to? Who are we interacting with? And how does that then shape what happens to us and how we engage the world? And then finally, sociologists talk about culture as an explanation or a social context that it could explain things. And this is the kind of big belief systems and ways of being and knowing and doing that end up shaping us. So we can think about how it is that we organize our world, how it is that we think about ourselves and our place in the world that then shapes what we're able to do. Now, these are the kind of big structural context that then shape us. And I want you to kind of, again, see this distinction between individualistic and structural explanations and kind of understand some of the rudimentary aspects of structural explanations or of social context that shapes what goes on. This is really at the center of sociology. So how does this help us to then think about different ways to explain poverty? Well, we can, again, distinguish between individualistic explanations of poverty and structural explanations of poverty. Now, when we're thinking about this, again, to think about individualistic explanations is to think about something about the individuals who are poor that makes them unable to get out of poverty, that makes them more likely to live in poverty. So if we're thinking individualistically about this, we're thinking there's something distinctive about poor people that makes them more likely to be poor. And these are now explanations you're probably familiar with. The poor are lazy and unmotivated, right? That's an explanation that says, okay, there's something different about those who are poor that makes them more likely to remain poor, right? There's something distinctive about people who are not poor, who are able to get out of poverty or who don't live in poverty. There's something unique about them that makes it possible for them to live a life outside of poverty, right? This is saying the poor are lazy, the non-poor are motivated, are hardworking, right? And these are common explanations that you expect to see. Now, there's a core problem with this. There's actually many problems with this that I want you to see, but there's a core problem that leads sociologists to move away from individualistic explanations and towards structural explanations. It has a really hard time explaining why in some countries there are a very high rate of poverty, and in other countries there's a very limited poverty, right, or low poverty rates. Right. When you just look across countries, you can look at many developing countries where you see large numbers of the population living in poverty, and you can look at countries with strong welfare states, like let's say Sweden, the Scandinavian countries like Sweden or Denmark or Finland or Norway, who have very low poverty rates. And unless you're willing to say that there's something different about people who are from Sweden than people who are from India or Brazil or poor people in the U.S., then you have a hard time explaining that difference, right? Are we really willing to say there's something special about Swedes that makes them more likely to be not in poverty than people who are in the U.S. or who are in India, which have higher rates of poverty? That becomes very difficult as an argument to sustain. And so most sociologists have moved towards thinking about this in structural terms, to say, no, there's something unique about the society in which we live that makes it more likely for some people to be living in poverty. Right? There's particular traits about Sweden that makes that poverty rate lower than the U.S., which has a much higher poverty rate. And here, the explanations are quite clear and quite motivating, that there are key social policies in place that reduce poverty in those low poverty rate countries. They have policies in place to ensure that wage rates are set very high. They have higher minimum wage rates, or they have other kinds of social policies in place to replace wages, like strong unemployment insurance that replace wages if someone is unemployed. This keeps people's wages high, even sometimes when they go into unemployment, and makes it more likely for them to stay out of poverty. They also have higher rates of social expenditures. That is to say, they spend money on things like education, daycare, on health care, and all of these things that increase, that poor people in the U.S. don't have access to and have to pay a lot of money out of pocket to obtain. Right? So they have a high rate of social expenditures, lots of taxes and transfers, transferring money to those who are poor to help lift them out of poverty. And these are the core reasons that sociologists tend to argue why some countries have higher poverty rates than others. The key question, though, for you is, well, what do you think? You should read the text that has lots of information to explain and help you think about poverty and why some people are more likely to be poor than others, and why some countries especially have higher rates of poverty than others. Take a look at that chapter, take a look at that evidence, and figure out for yourself, what do you think about this? All right, talk to you guys next time.